What happened to GDP? Nobody. Okay, that's kind of what I expected. Now, I hope that one of the ways I influenced your lives with these economics classes is that if you happen to see it come out at some point today or in your lifetime, you have a better understanding. So, it's all over the news today. So GDP report, U.S. economy grew at 1.6%. Economy grew far less than projected. This just came out yesterday. So remember we're behind always on knowing what GDP is. So this is last quarter's GDP that we're getting reported on. And so that is kind of here. Key Federal Reserve inflation rate sizzles as GDP slows. So I wanted to pull up at least one of these, and that's going to be your extra credit here, as we're going to make some notes down. So, yeah. Stocks opened sharply lower Thursday after a sharply lower than expected U.S. GDP for the first quarter ratcheted up questions about the health of the United States economy in the face of persistently high interest rates. Tech stocks led the way down as Meta's revenue forecast. What's Meta? Facebook. Eyeing high stocks cap. NASDAQ fell. So this is kind of stock market reporting, but this is the main thing I wanted to get at. So you go into all these articles and there's going to be different insights that the author's going to do. But U.S. GDP growth came in at 1.6, falling well short of expectations at 2.5. So I want you to write that down. First quarter GDP estimates, which again, these aren't perfect, they'll get adjusted again, shows 1.6%, which is an annualized number. They're analyzing the first quarter, but came in at below expectations, because this chapter that we're going to talk about today looks at expectations. So, on your paper also, on your extra credit paper, just draw aggregate demand, aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, real GDP, and the price level. So the price level here, if we look at the other parts of this article, so this is, let me finish off at least a home base here. So here's our starting place, Y1. And here's our price level, PL1. So just kind of a starting place for our short run situation, which is what we're really looking at here, not the long run. So we'll just leave the long run off this time. Treasury yields. Oh wait, I wanted to finish this. The reading comes amid ongoing debate about the path of the Federal Reserve's interest rate campaign. So when is the Federal Reserve going to make some moves, which we've been talking about this week? Treasury yields rose after the GDP, with the benchmark 10-year surging to its highest levels. So Treasury yields are the rates of return off those government bonds. Well, this is more stock market stuff. I'm going to skip. You guys can, of course, read it if you want there. And on the macroeconomic front, the spotlight will turn to the reading of the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. So the PCE, and this is different than the article I read this morning. I looked 15 minutes ago, it was Yahoo Finance. I wonder if that's this one. I had a nice little graph for you guys. Stock market search.
Does it update automatically?
Let me click this. Aha! This is the one I wanted. Okay. They're all kind of saying the same thing, but must have been a different author. All right, so same thing with the 1.6, 2.7, but this is what I wanted to show you guys here. These are the real numbers from back to 21 of what GDP's been doing. Here we went negative, so the economy slowed to a point where it actually shrank a little bit. And here's the other growth numbers in the little over 2% range. This was a big jump here, and then it's been coming down. So quarter three. So all of this is broke down in terms of quarters. All right, so then let's see. I wanted to get here. The softer than expected sign of the Federal Reserve's historic interest rate hikes are putting pressure on consumers and the economy. Investors have been closely watching economic data for clues when the central bank will begin to lower rates. So we talked about, was this restrictive policy or expansionary policy by the Federal Reserve that has jacked up interest rates? Here this thing's saying, when are they going to lower them again? So is it restrictive or expansionary when we have interest rates going up? Restrictive, right? So we're restricting back the money supply, driving up the interest rates. So from our money market, we're measuring the quantity of money and the interest rates, money demand, and money supply. To get interest rates up, the Fed made moves to decrease the money supply, right? And so interest rates are up. And why did they do that? Well, they're trying to slow down the inflation rate. And so what this is saying here is that people are responding to that now. So we're seeing consumers with pressure with those higher interest rates that are changing. So for the quarter, personal consumption declined to 2.5% from the prior quarter of 3.3%. So personal consumption is our cigarettes. So we have our Y equals C plus I plus G plus X. And so there's always, in my opinion, overemphasis, by the way, on consumption. So it's like, oh, we got to get these consumers spending more. We got to get them spending more. Well, they're trying to control inflation, and so part of this is seeing personal consumption was lower than what they'd expected. So that's gone down. So we've seen a little bit of this being lower than what was expected anyway. It still grew, but it's a little bit lower than what was expected. So let's see. Compared to the fourth quarter growth, deceleration of real GDP in the first quarter primarily reflected decelerations in consumer spending. Exports, boom. And state and local government spending, boom. So down, 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 right? So all of this came in a little bit under what they were expecting. These movements were partly offset by the acceleration in residential fixed investment. So apparently the I offset some of these downs, right? So they're just picking apart these major components that we've been talking about. So I'm hoping you start to see this is like real stuff that gets talked about, right? In the economy and how it's going. And hopefully you guys are a little more informed now than you before starting the course. All right, slower projected growth came alongside surprisingly high inflation reading. The core personal consumption, which excludes food and energy, grew by 3.7%, above estimates of 3.4%. So again, the brightest minds on this stuff, brighter than mine. I mean, these people watch this stuff like religiously, right? They know all of the academic aspects of it, all of that. They predicted 3.4. They're wrong. They're wrong. They're wrong. They're wrong. They're wrong. This is not something that's easy. Humanity is complex, right? And you start taking all of our interactions, and the complexity even grows more. So, is it wise to have, the government in more and more control of things when it's not predictable? I say no. Some other people might say, I don't know, it just feels right. But I think the evidence is there that it might be smarter to kind of leave people be alone a little bit and encourage more individual freedom. All right, so that's fine, but this happens. We're still going to be always predicting and trying to see what's going on. Stock futures tied to all three major indexes shot lower. So your mom and dad's retirement funds probably took a little bit of a dip when we look at the stock market, because the the performance of these is tied to the overall economy. If the overall economy is not performing as well, then businesses aren't going to be performing as well, right? And so people start to make some moves. Okay, so now I wanted to go back to this. So we had inflation that didn't go up as much. So when we come to this picture, we had growth. So we moved this direction somehow. So Y2 was 1.6% higher. So the economy did show some growth. We're not moving, we're not shrinking, but the growth wasn't as much as what was expected. Now, how did we get there? Well, over time then we have some changes in resources and expectations, so it was likely some combination of these two things. We had prices still grow, and it actually grew by 3.7 above the estimates. So if I shift both these curves, who won out? If the short-run aggregate supply curve moved this way and the aggregate demand curve moved this way, because they probably did a little bit of both, right? To get growth of 1.6%, we have to be in this region to the right of this dashed line. Who won out? Was aggregate demand bigger than aggregate supply or vice versa? How do we get, go ahead.
Aggregate supply?
Aggregate supply, bigger or smaller?
Bigger.
Okay, so if I go bigger and I go way down here and then I make aggregate demand a little bit smaller, our new equilibrium point's going to be down here. So it's the demand, right? So that's how you kind of see that going on. In order for me to get this result of 3.7%, so the price level grew by 3.7%, I have to be somewhere over here. And it might be, well, now I need to follow at least my Y2. I guess maybe I need to shove it up there a little bit, but maybe something like this. Again, I'm just drawing lines on a board, so I can cheat a little bit. And so we've had a little bit of movement this way, perhaps, but a bigger movement in aggregate demand, causing prices to shoot up again. Probably, at least in large part, attributable to that money sloshing around the system still, right? So we still have the money from the COVID bonds, from what the Fed did in pumping up the money supply through the open market purchase. When the Fed goes in and buys the government bond was out there, the Fed has money, the Fed went and purchased that bond, but that was a couple of years ago. That money's still sloshing around the system because the Fed did not move that aggressively to reduce the money supply. They actually just kind of flattened it out. So if some of the old charts that we've seen when we did some other stuff here the last week or so, the money supply is flattened out. So they're just kind of tabled things in terms of the relationship of the money supply and the inflation rate. And so we're still trying to wring out some of that inflation, and they're not succeeding very well. Their stated goal is to get down to 2%, and they can't quite seem to get there very fast. And I've heard, maybe it's in this article, did I see a hand? Tim? Okay. So this article's pretty short, it's almost done. Prior to Thursday's GDP, an overall healthy reading on the U.S. economy through the first quarter had been a key talking point among economists and the Fed itself when reasoning why the central bank can hold rates high while it waits for inflation to fall further. Given the strength of the labor market, which is talking really about unemployment's still under 4%. Given the strength of the labor market and progress on inflation so far, it's appropriate to allow restrictive policy further time to work and let the data evolving around this. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, the guy we've been talking about, that is kind of the second most powerful person in Washington, D.C. And he said that on April 16th. So this report just came out yesterday, the 24th. He had made that statement on the 16th. Okay, that's it. So questions or comments there?
Who's the third most powerful?
Oh, I don't know. I always just think of 1 and 2. Number 3 doesn't really matter too much. Maybe, I think some people might argue the vice president. If Joe Biden dies, then the vice president, but probably not even the vice president. It's probably somebody else in the national security or the armed forces, the generals. They're probably pretty wield some power, but I think it's a distant third place compared to being able to influence inflation and being able to call the shots on World War III. It's a distant third, I think, for that. Okay. Good? All right, turn those in. First name, last name. Make sure you got your stuff on there. Give you guys a little practice. Yeah, question?
Yeah. So, do you think that is planned by the Fed, that the progress of getting the interest rates lower to take so much time? Like
Do you think it's what?
That it's planned, that it takes so much time?
Planned in the sense of them not being as aggressive. Because if they were more aggressive, their feelings are, we will create a recession. So if they're more aggressive with interest rates, then maybe we fall even flatter. So that's their mentality anyway, is to not be too aggressive with it.
So they're very careful.
Well, yeah, I think they're cautious on that. I think probably overly cautious sometimes. So they don't want to be the ones that drove into recession. So back in the 1980s, when Wayne Angell served on the chair of the Federal Reserve was Paul Volcker, and we came out of the high inflation era, and he jacked interest rates way up. He severely reduced the money supply, drove the economy into recession, but then we quickly recovered. So I actually like that cure better than stringing this thing along for a number of years. So that's kind of different people's opinions on it, but really he's lauded as one of the better Fed chairs for having the courage to do that, right? Imagine he's the guy who drove the economy into recession, essentially. He kind of called the shot, said, we're gonna wipe this inflation out, this is ridiculous, and so, whoop, and economy goes into recession. That was the 82 recession. If we look back on some of our data, which we'll see some today, was caused really by the Fed. But then we went through the longest expansion since World War II. So during the Reagan years and the Bush years and into even the Clinton era, so over multiple parties, we had 16 years of expansion because we just kind of said, let's knock this crap out, right? Let's take our medicine. We're gonna be sick for a while, but it'll be short, and then we can be on the road to prosperity. I like that solution a lot better in general. Okay, anybody else?
Do you think Jerome Powell, or maybe if someone replaced him, would have the guts to do that again?
We seem to be limited on guts nowadays, so I don't foresee that. So we don't have people with that type of gusto, let's say. So okay, how many people, show of hands, feel like you're more informed now about this stuff than you were in the past? Show of hands. Okay, good. That just makes me feel good a little bit that you are getting something out of that. So, all right, let's get rid of this. Okay, so I kind of want to play around with this thought here and highlight something that I haven't really talked about yet. So when we've been drawing the graphs, we always draw the long run aggregate supply curve, right? But in reality, the policymakers even, they don't know where the long run graph is. They don't know if it's over here, if it's over here. And that also makes it difficult to decide what policy would be the most appropriate. So let me do the expansionary policy, which is kind of what got us into this mess in the first place. So let's do expansionary monetary policy effect. So let's title this, Where is the Long-Run Aggregate Supply? And I'll just put the answer to it. We don't know. We can kind of speculate, but it kind of changes the nature of what people are doing, what problem they're trying to solve, depending on where that is. So we're going to put two graphs up here. And we're going to draw just the short run, the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply on both graphs. So this just gives us some sort of current state of the economy is at Y1 and this price level. If the Fed pursues expansionary monetary policy, is the money supply curve shifting to the right or to the left? If the Fed is pursuing expansionary monetary policy, to the right, right? So you can kind of hang your head on these words that if they're pursuing a expansionary monetary policy, then we have the money supply moving to the right. What's happening to interest rates? Up or down? Back row, Alex? Down. All right, so interest rates are falling. And so this is getting people to consume and invest and all of that. So on this picture, expansionary monetary policy has us go, if this is when the money supply was at MS1, MS2, aggregate demand at MS2 with expansionary policy is pushing the economy out. So again, for both graphs, we can put MS1, MS2.
He's gonna take.
Okay, so the point here is that the purpose of expansionary monetary supply is to try to stimulate the economy, right? What are the three biggies that we hope Fed Chair Powell and President Joe Biden and the members of Congress are always keeping in mind? The three biggies. I want you guys to have these memorized for the final exam. The three biggies. What do we want going on? Kind of our desired outcome for the economy. Yeah, not it? Low and stable inflation is one of them. Good. Low and stable inflation. What else? Low unemployment at the natural rate. And then what's the last one? Got it? Yep, low inflation. So we got low and stable inflation, unemployment at the natural rate or low unemployment. The third one's the big one. Increasing real GDP. We want this to be going on, right? So we want this thing moving this way. So increasing real GDP, low and stable inflation, and low unemployment. Now, you guys just read that current article. How are we doing on those things from that report? Well, GDP didn't go up as much as expected, so that one's kind of a negative. Price level went up more than expected. Negative or positive? Negative. And unemployment is? Strong. Strong unemployment. It was, we're at 3.7%, I think was the last data point. So we've been staying under 4%. So out of the three things, if we were scoring the economy, bad, bad, decent, good, probably good. I would call it the strong unemployment, the unemployment number is good. So we've got two bads and a good, right? And so that's kind of a scorecard that we can think about when we're using, trying to predict what the Fed is doing and the impacts that it'll have. All right, so now back to my question here, where is the long run aggregate supply curve? That's kind of a key part of this. So on the graph to the left, if the long run aggregate supply curve was here, was it a smart move for the Fed to do monetary policy? Or on the flip side here, I don't want to draw it yet, if the Fed did expansionary monetary policy and the long run aggregate supply curve was here, was that good to do? So that's the thing I'm kind of posing here, is that the Fed actually doesn't know, nobody knows, it's kind of a theoretical, we can estimate, but nobody actually knows where this thing is. And so if the Fed is trying to get the economy going because they think it's okay, or they think that coming out of COVID it would be a good policy to do that, it makes a difference on where the long run aggregate supply curve is. So now let's go ahead and draw them in. I guess I'll use my green here. So if the long run aggregate supply curve was here, on the left panel, in my humble opinion, this was stupid monetary policy. So this is bad or stupid, bad, stupid, dumb, possibly ignorant, I don't know. Okay, I'll just try to lay it on a little bit thick here. Why do I say that? Well, where is the economy going to end up in the long run? How did this policy affect the economy over the long haul? Did it help real GDP? No. That's the key thing that I think it's dumb, is that we shouldn't be doing expansionary policy if we're already operating at the full employment level of output. Because remember, we've done this quite a few times now. In the short run, maybe we will expand the economy, but in the long run, we're going to end up back here to point C. So it's dumb in that the policy just created inflation. This is the recent Federal Reserve, in my opinion. Kind of did some dumb stuff where we tried to pump up the economy, and it turned out to be pretty inflationary. It didn't really get us going. We're just paying the consequences over time without any direct effect to long-run aggregate supply. Good time to think about what are the long-run aggregate supply shifters. Look back in your notes, those are important. What does make an economy grow? This is where we're going into next week, by the way. What does make the economy grow?
New inventions or discoveries.
Okay, good. New resources, right? Yeah, they could be through technology. Well, inventions probably be a little bit more on technology side, perhaps. So good. So we've got new inventions or technology. So technology in general is the word we use to kind of capture that idea, the increase in technology. To be a little more precise, an invention that does not make us more productive, like it helps the production process, is not what we're looking for with technology, right? So on the technology side, we're looking to kind of use less resources because it frees up resources for other things if we come up with a new technology. So technology is a little more specific in something that makes us more productive so that we can make more stuff, make more real GDP because of the new technology. All right, and then we kind of said the other one. Anybody find it in their notes? What was the other thing? So we had technology is one. What was the other thing? How do we grow this economy of ours? What do we need more of? We've hopefully learned we don't need more money. Money's not going to help grow the economy. Look back at your long run aggregate supply shifters. It should be from about 3 weeks ago. You might find it somewhere else. Tim? Increase in the labor force. So increase in any resources for that matter. So a new discovery of oil, a technological advance in solar or something, nuclear power, right? Any sort of increase in quantity of energy or resources, the labor force, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Those were our 4 basic resources. Anything that increases the resource base allows us to make more stuff. So long run economic growth is this baby move in this direction. Slowly but surely, over time, resources growing and the economy growing at a good, sustainable rate for the population, labor force, and resource growth. Some of that resource growth can come from institutional changes. So if we have an oppressive government that doesn't allow certain resources to be put into place as easily as other things, then we might have, if there was a change of government or something, a change of regime, a change of policy that allowed resources to be used more freely and more productively, then that could lead to long-run economic growth as well. So kind of we talked about institutional changes, quantity of resources, and technology. That's where growth comes from. It doesn't come through money growth. Money growth ultimately leads to inflation. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower. So if there's something that moved this direction, notice that this price level wouldn't be quite as high, right? So if there was a little bit of, even if it was pathetic, like 1.6%. 1.6% is lower than our long run growth for the United States is between 2 and 3%. So 1.6 is a little of a downer, but it's still 1.6. So we still move this way a little tiny bit, which means that price level didn't go quite up as high as it would have, right? So we still had some real economic growth moving this way for that change. But ultimately, bad monetary policy because the change in money just created inflation and all by itself did not create any economic growth. It didn't have any real effects for us as citizens in terms of the number of groceries we can put in our grocery cart. In fact, all of our groceries are a lot higher, right? And we can't put more in our cart. Tim?
So what should the Fed have done instead? Like, can they even do something to change the roadmap?
Well, that's a little bit what I touched on before. If you're talking about undoing what they did, they could have did a bigger change and drove us into recession possibly, just to kind of wipe out all that inflation. But you guys, the dollar hamburger is never going to be $1 again. Prices aren't going to go down. Under the current policies, we would have to have deflation for us to get back to what groceries used to cost. My wife just told me this morning, I bought these, not really energy bars, but kind of breakfast bar, the Kind, K-I-N-D, and she said these were $14. And I'm like, they're never going down again, honey. There's always going to be inflation. That was probably something that 2 years ago maybe would have been, I don't know, $8 or $9 or $10. But food inflation has really gone up, and it ain't going down. So even when the Fed is going to come out and say, yay, we finally got back to 2% inflation, we are successful, kind of patting themselves on the chest, we're still going to be paying $14 for the Kind bars. Your groceries are not going to go down in value. The inflation rate is coming down, but it's still positive. That means the Kind bars next year, if we get to 2% inflation, instead of being $14, will be 2% higher than 14. The prices are always going up under what we're currently doing with our Fed policy, even when we get back to, let's just say, a more normal. On our podcast, so I think I've mentioned this before, but we have our weekly Faith in Economics podcast that Dr. Clark, myself, and Dr. Jacobson it comes out every Monday. And yesterday, this was part of what we were talking about with our deflation, and how that's why it was kind of at the top of mind that these groceries aren't going to be coming down at all. And Peter made the comment from some other economist that said, the reason why the Fed targets 2%, or that the government says 2%, is because it's the amount they can get away with. It might have been Dr. Clark, I can't remember, one of those guys, but it's the amount they can get away with. Because the inflation is really a tax on you guys, right? On everybody, and it's a flat tax. Everybody pays it, whether you're poor or whether you're rich. You go to the grocery store, everybody's paying this 10, 20, 30% more in price. When they do it, it just hurts the poor more. So it's really a flat tax. And so when it's at 2%, you know, myself included, even as worked up as I get about this, it's like, oh, okay, so the dollar hamburger used to be $1, now it's $1.02, 2 cents, big deal, right? It is a big deal for the government to capture that 2% because it's on $20-some trillion. So if they can tax all of us through inflation at a tune of 2%, 2% of $20 trillion is a decent chunk of change, right? So, but it's enough that people don't get worked up about. And so the government finds it an easy way to get money out of us through this sometimes called inflation tax. Tim?
So would it be possible to have inflation of 0? Like, would it make no difference for us?
I think it would be great. Yeah, and listen to our podcast. Maybe I'll try to send it out. Kevin, kind of help me remember to. I'll just send it out to the class when we release it. It's going to come out like in a week or two, so it might be after we're done with class. But I'll try to remember to send it out to you guys.
This Monday.
No, we talked about how great it would be if we had 0%. Like imagine 40 years ago, I bought a loaf of bread for $2, and now today it's $2. Would that ruin my life somehow? That would be freaking great, right? I mean, what's wrong with prices staying, consistent on average with the price of a cart of groceries? Jesse?
In some cases, like growing up, I was told by certain peoples that inflation was a good thing and that it should grow a little bit every year.
Yes, we've been brainwashed by that, yes. So on the podcast, we talk about the kind of traditional arguments for having positive inflation. So we made that argument, and then hopefully you'll agree I destroyed it. So, but yeah, it was that is the old argument, and there's an economist named Selgin that Peter described the argument for the positive, and so but it's not a good one. And I got out my shotgun and blew holes in it. Justin.
Do you think people use the inflation thing as a point to say the U.S. moving forward? Because if you had 0% inflation, if it's $2 that's what it is now, there's no growth. As an economy,
The growth part that we care about is real GDP. The quantities of stuff. So yeah, there's no good argument, in my opinion, coming back for why a positive rate. The real rate, and we're going to get into this. Hopefully, I gotta get moving along here. I might be talking too much. The debt. So imagine, the Chinese hold a bunch of bonds, right? They hold a bunch of these, and so they're getting paid in dollars. So if the U.S. government pays the Chinese $10 billion in dollars, but yet inflation is 10%, that works to the government's benefit. So that's another angle on this, that the government likes to see positive inflation because it actually makes borrowing a little cheaper for them through having some positive rates of inflation. So, but a lot of that gets taken into account when you buy the bond. So again, I'll send out the podcast. I really like that podcast. I might try to send that out a little bit more.
Yeah. From what I'm getting from all this, would the better policy be overall to have constant deflation throughout the years? Or
I think whether it's 0 or fixed at something or other, we're going to be able to live our lives. It's when it changes, when it's unanticipated changes is what causes the problems. So yeah, and again, the title of the podcast is deflation, because I wanted to kind of highlight what's the problem with falling prices. So anyway, all right, that's enough said. Let's go back to our picture here and wrap this up so we can move on to the next content. So this one's bad. This one here, what I want to do is draw the long run aggregate supply curve here. So if we draw it here, and we have this increase to PL2, what happened is we were in recession, right? The current state of the economy was below where we thought the economy should be in the long run. And therefore, having monetary policy still created inflation, which isn't great, that's on our bad list, but at least it increased real GDP, which is good, right? So let's at least give this a not as bad monetary policy. I'm not willing to give it a good, but it's not as bad because you have an increase in output back to the long run, back to the full employment level. So remember, the long run is kind of showing this full employment level of output. Okay, so let's wrap that up. Any questions on the mechanics there?
Is this the end of chapter 14?
Yes. So that'll wrap up chapter 14. So with 15 here, we'll get into some related stuff and kind of continue on, but in a little bit different way. The focus of 14 was on monetary policy. And so this chapter is macro policy and the federal debt. So chapter 15, macro policy and the federal debt. So we'll dive into a little more details than what we have so far. So the author kind of talks about two different philosophies, or two different opinions on the economy. So we have what we call the activists. So two let's say types of policy thinking. So number one are people who believe in an activist approach. So these are economists. Let's just put not Russ. Yeah, figured it out. Economists that believe in that discretionary meaning people changing the policy, discretionary monetary and fiscal policy can reduce instability in output, which is our real GDP, and employment. Okay, in general, these would be the Keynesians. So note, I might call them the Keynesians after John Maynard Keynes. He's the one that really popularized a more activist approach of government to try to bring stability to the ups and downs of the economy. And the non-activists believe that discretionary policy actually increases instability. So number 2, the non-activist believe that policy responses to cyclical conditions are likely to increase instability. Of real GDP and unemployment. So, non-activist economists like me favor more stable and predictable policies. Favor more stable and predictable policies. So, it doesn't mean we want to take government out of the picture, but how we structure, let's say, unemployment or food stamps would be to have it be more predictable, rather than the president jumping on the microphone and saying, we're going to cut checks to everybody to help them out, we're going to change this policy, in response to the recession, we're going to increase unemployment benefits, right? So kind of like moving the needle on what it is. It would be to just keep what we have on the books. So for example, keep, let's say, unemployment benefits at a constant known known amount, rather than increasing it in response to a recession. It would be kind of one example. We just kind of leave the rule of law. It doesn't mean the rule of law can't ever change, but we don't want to increase it now and then decrease it later. Oh, we're going to reduce that program now, and so your unemployment benefits are going to be reduced back to previous levels, or unemployment rates is so good right now, we're going to cut unemployment benefits. So we might be changing it. Just make things predictable and stable. Any questions on that? All right, so this would be people more on the Hayek and Friedman. Friedman would be a little bit more questionable, but kind of Adam Smith, you know, invisible hand over government hand. Again, we're not eliminating the government, but we're making the government more predictable and stable rather than actively always trying to meddle with the system. Does that make sense? It's really kind of important to get that, because I think unfortunately when some people think of the activists versus non-activists, they're like, oh, you just don't want to do nothing, right? You want to take away the benefits, or you know, you don't want to help people or whatever. That's not the case. It's just making it more stable. All right, and so I think there's some reasons for this, and it's called the time lag problem, which we've talked a little bit about before already, but we're going to look in a little more detail now. So the time lag problem for policy. Okay, so here's kind of a timeline of, let's say, economy bad, whatever that means. Because of the time lag problem, we have some other things that kick in. So the economy's bad, and then there's a period of time before we recognize that there's even a problem. So we have recognition lag, which is learning we have a problem. So it's kind of nice that we started off with that article today, that we are learning the first quarter estimates of real GDP, and now we're at the end of April, beginning of May, right? So there's this time frame of even learning about when it was. That's recognizing that the economy is down. So this is some period of time. So the recognition lag is time. So, you know, maybe, for example, it takes 3 months. Oh, we have a problem, Houston, right? So we get the data and we learn there's a problem. Then we've got another period of time to do something about it. And so that's called the administrative lag. Administrative lag. So this is the time it takes to craft a response, right? So policymakers craft a policy in response. So it sits in Congress, and the politicians, you know, deliberate, like, should we do something? Should we, this could be monetary policy. Should we increase the money supply? Should we decrease the money supply? But if we're thinking about Congress or something, maybe it takes, Congress is out of session, and so maybe another 3 months goes by. Okay, and then they finally put it into place. Okay, we know what we're going to do. We're going to increase unemployment benefits. We're going to increase unemployment benefits, or whatever their policy response is. And that leads us to our last leg, which is the impact leg. Once they change the law and say, hey, everybody's going to get an extra $600 for unemployment, that doesn't immediately impact the economy, right? So it takes a while to kind of filter through. So the impact lag is the time needed for policy to impact economy. And so who knows how long this takes, depends on the type of policy, but I've been just using 3 months just to get you guys thinking, like, I think that's fairly fair that 9 months goes by. In the case of the Federal Reserve that we've been talking so much about, they increased the money supply by $4 trillion 2 years ago. And the impact is still going on today. So this impact lag for that is looking like 3 years already before they think we might get back to, some sort of 2% level if that was our goal. So with all of this going on, that doesn't look like a very effective way to handle this bad economy here. Because if the economy's bad here, and it takes 9 months later to do something, is it possible that the economy was already starting to be good here or here? It's possible, right? We don't know, because we can start to look, but because we don't learn for 3 months, we have this recognition lag. We went through all of these gyrations, and now maybe we do get new data. Oh, well, good, the economy's not as bad as we thought it was, but we did all this work with this policy, and of course the policymakers want to look good. So they're like, well, we'll still do the policy. Maybe it's not even needed as much, but they'd have to reevaluate and redo it, right? So it kind of messes up the sequence. All right, so, so the key point from these lags, the key point is by the time a policy has its impact, it is likely the wrong policy for the current state of the economy. By the time a policy has its impact, it's likely the wrong policy response. In general, the Federal Reserve, by the way, one of the positives, I guess, if you want to call it that, if you think the Federal Reserve is helping more than it's hurting, is that it had a lot shorter lag period. So it usually, when, let's say, things were normal, the responses would be there a little quicker compared to fiscal policy. All right, any questions or comments there? All right, so this next part is going to look at ways we can predict signals of where we're at in the economy. So we're going to look at what's called leading indicators. We've learned over time that there are some variables that tend to be in front of the turning points of the economy. So way back to chapter 7, I think it's 7. So recall chapter 7, and we've put it on the board before, business cycle. That is this one. So we're just going to do some simple ups and downs of the economy. So we're measuring real GDP on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. And so we had the 4 phases of the business cycle was peak, recession, trough, expansion. Ups and downs of the economy. This is the stability thing that we're kind of leading this off with. Can policy help stabilize the ups and downs, or does policy make it more of a wild ride? The non-activists say policy makes this more of a wild ride. Other people think that policy can be useful to stabilize things. All right, so now we can use, there are variables. So leading economic variables tend to turn before the economy turns with real GDP. But of course, they're not perfect. There's nothing that's obviously even our, like I said, the greatest, brightest minds in economics can't predict it very well. So, number one, there's going to be 10 of these. So we got 10 variables we're going to look at. Number one is the length of the average work week. Length of average work week.
Yes.
So if if people are working longer, they're putting in more hours, maybe putting in some overtime, if the average work week starts to lengthen, is that a sign of an expanding economy or a contracting economy? If the work week length increases. Expanding, right? So there's more work to be done, right? The economy's doing good. So the length of the work week here, an increase in the length of the work week is signals expansion. And so what's happening is it might be starting to turn, it's expanding here before we learn that that's expanding. Number two, weekly claims for unemployment. Weekly claims for unemployment. If there's less people claiming unemployment, what do you think that's a sign of? An expanding economy or a contracting economy? Less weekly claims, less people claiming unemployment. Expanding, right? So that is expanding. Number three, new orders placed with manufacturers. New orders placed with manufacturers. So this would be somebody trying to create a final product, and they need more of these plastic shells for the remote. And so they're like, hey, we need to order 10,000 of these things. We gotta ramp up production, right? So new orders placed with manufacturers, if that's going up, if there's more new orders, expanding economy or contracting? Expanding. Number four, rather. That was number 3. Percentage of companies receiving slower deliveries. Percent of companies receiving slower deliveries. From suppliers. So what do you think of this? If there's more of a slowdown, an increase in the percentage of people receiving slower deliveries, is that a sign that the economy is expanding or contracting? This one's a little bit goofy, huh? Expanding or contracting? What do you think? Expanding? Contracting. Okay, so we got a debate here. So let's think about this. So if companies are getting slower orders from suppliers, why are they getting it slower now? Are the suppliers more busy or less busy?
They could have gotten a bunch of new drivers that don't have to.
More busy in general, right? So this one's a little bit weird. Like if they're slowing down, why are they slowing down? It's because they're really busy. So percentage leads to an expanding economy. But that one's a little bit not quite as intuitive. All right, number 5. Orders and contracts for new plant and equipment. So orders for new plant and equipment. So plant and equipment's kind of the fancy word for machines, right? Plant and equipment, machines, or if we want to use the big word in econ, it would be capital. So if people are buying new machines, more machines, expanding or contracting, if people are placing orders for some new equipment, is that a sign of an expanding economy or a contracting economy? New machines. Expanding, right? They're optimistic about the economy, so they are looking at some expansion. Number 6. Permits for new housing. Permits for new housing starts. So you're going to build a new house. More people are looking to build a house. They have to pull a permit. If there's an increase in new housing starts or permits for a new house, is that a sign of expansion or contraction? Expansion, right? So we got people optimistic. Hey, we can afford to buy this new house. And so that would be a sign of an economy expanding. All right, number 7 is the interest rate spread. Number 7. So the interest rate spread of 10-year Treasury, 10-year Treasury, and the federal funds rate. Fed funds rate, which is bank-to-bank lending. We haven't talked that much. So here, if there's a lower spread between the risk-free rate, that's leading to a sign of an expanding economy. So kind of the interest rates down concept. Number 8, consumer expectations. So they do survey data with consumers, survey of consumer expectations, and they say, how do you feel about the economy? You feel good? Do you think we're heading towards recession? Or how do you feel, right? And they'll take the data, and if on general people are feeling positive, that's a sign of an expanding economy. Number 9, stock prices. So the index of stock prices. So like the S&P 500 would be one of those indices. So if stock prices seem to be on the move, if they're increasing, is that a sign of a expanding economy or a contracting economy? We saw this on the article we started off with today. So stock prices are moving up. People feeling optimistic. Is that expanding? Yeah, right? So expanding. Now you guys have probably picked up that I'm doing all of these as expanding. Now let me get to number 10. I haven't seen that pattern. All right, change in the money supply. So a change in the money supply. And I guess, well, yeah. I guess I'll put it in brackets like I've been doing. All right, so if the Fed is expanding the money supply, lowering interest rates again, that would be a sign of them thinking we got an expanding economy. All right, so those are the leading indicators. Oh, before you put your notes away, I just want to put on here that what they do is they take all of these variables and smash them together into one number. So kind of the key point, all 10 variables are used to create a single index number. And then tomorrow I'll start you off with what that number looks like, how well it predicts inflation, or recession and expansion. See you tomorrow. Oh, you did? Okay. So, yeah, I'll have it ready with her then. Send me an email about the time.
Okay, it's actually 8:30, but I put a note in there so that
Okay. Just tell me when you're gonna take it. If it's 9, just put 9. Okay. Send me an email, because I need to get the test over.
all right, I'll send you a screenshot.
If anybody else came in late, you can sign for attendance. Now, I haven't gone through all my emails. You emailed me something, Caroline, didn't you?
Yes, sir. I was called for a tournament Monday through Wednesday. I just wanted to let you know.
Oh, so yeah, we covered. So yeah, we pretty much just focused all that time on chapter 14, as you probably picked up, since we're just starting 15 now. So, okay. Yeah, make sure you hit the reading, and I don't know if have you been looking at the recordings?
I have, yes, sir.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
I mean, it's still illegal, but you could